it all possible. You gave me these notes. This is the first time you've actually been here, so I feel like even though this is my third time doing this, I feel really on the spot. Welcome. There's a lot of seats up front here. There's 6 seats up front. Good. So tonight's talk is the third one in our ecology lecture series. Next Thursday will be our final one of the season, Thursday, August 8th, when Shelby Perry, Wildlands ecologist at the Northeast Wilderness Trust, will be here speaking. But tonight we have David Foster. David Foster is an ecologist and director emeritus of the Harvard Forest, Harvard University's 4,000-acre ecological laboratory. His research focuses on interpreting landscape dynamics from climate change, a little typo here, climate change and human use, and other factors, and applying these results to conservation. In 2005, David and colleagues developed Wildlands and Woodlands, a vision for the New England landscape, an ambitious initiative for forest and farmland conservation, integrated community development. He's the author of Hemlock, a forest giant on the edge, and a meeting of land and sea, nature, and the future of Martha's Vineyard. And he comes to us from Martha's Vineyard, from one island to another. And, let's welcome David.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to Monhegan Associates for inviting me here. And thanks especially to Tish Miller and Jack for entertaining us so delightfully. We've been around the island. This is fun. So tonight I'm going to be talking actually in many ways about Monhegan and about all that has been accomplished here in terms of establishing and taking care of these wildlands that you have, which are an essential part, I will argue, of the entire island and the community. As background to that, I'm going to start with this report, which came out this past year, which is an assessment of all of the wildlands in the 6 New England states. And you'll come to see, I hope, that Monhegan has done something really quite unusual in the whole field of land conservation and adds to a body of conservation work which is a kind of leading edge of activity across New England. This report was put together by a group of authors that you can see listed here, representing universities, research organizations, and conservation organizations. Especially important here was Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, this regional initiative that we established back in 2005, working very closely with Northeast Wilderness Trust, which will be represented here next week by Shelby Perry, their ecologist, wildland ecologist. But also the Highstead Foundation, which has funded an awful lot of our work, and Harvard Forest, which is the research institute at Harvard University. So I'll start off by talking about that, and then I will switch and talk directly about Monhegan. And before I get into our report, I want to draw attention to 2 other works that are going to be forthcoming that highlight Monhegan. The first, many of you are probably aware of, which is the catalog for this wonderful exhibit and history, ecology, and conservation perspective on Monhegan. It's a fabulous book that Tish has contributed a chapter to, Doug Boynton has contributed to, and of course Jen Pye has served as an editor along with Barry Logan Quarterly, there's a wonderful article that has been written by Richard Farrell that is a perspective on wildlands, what it means to conserve them in an era of social media and a lot of attention towards accommodation and making things accessible, easy, and safe for people. And it's a delightful piece. Those of you, and I imagine there are many people here who know Richard, will recognize his very strong opinions about how wildlands should be managed. So I want to start off first with this definition, which I will turn around and read, but you can read it on the screen. I want to underscore the fact in the world of land conservation, there are many different ways that you can conserve land and treat it. You can conserve farmland and continue to manage it. You can conserve forest land and continue to harvest timber. You can conserve oceans and set some of it aside for natural process and continue to harvest other parts of it. Wildlands, as understood here on Monhegan and as translated and understood in the definition that we use for our report, are really unusual because they are set aside strictly for natural processes to unfold and for people to visit and enjoy, but not alter. And so this definition of wildlands are tracts of any size and current condition, so any condition today, that are permanently protected from development, in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural processes to prevail with free will. That is, without direct intervention and constraint by people. So with minimal interference by humans. We also, of course, recognize that humans have been a part of nature forever, essentially, but certainly for many millennia in places like Monhegan. And so they can coexist within and with wildlands without intentionally altering their structure, their composition, or their function. So this is very distinct from a lot of other land trust lands, a lot of other conservation lands. So the background to this study actually starts in 2005 when we created this organization called Wildlands and Woodlands, which has as a vision conserving about 80% of New England permanently from development, but managing that in a number of different ways that range from a wildland approach where humans have no interference with nature to other areas that are very actively managed. Well, in 2005, when we wrote this study, of course, one of our first questions was, well, how many areas in New England are actually managed in this hands-off fashion? This very intentional determination of not interfering with nature. We couldn't find the answer for that, and it actually turns out that there's no place in the United States where that has been determined. This study that we did for New England is the first attempt by anyone to catalog all of the areas. And it was in the process of doing that work that I happened to come to Monhegan and discover that you were in many ways an exemplar of what we were talking about. Now, many people have recognized that this approach, this kind of wildlands conservation approach, is essential in an era when we are facing climate change and really the transformation of the earth. That to have significant large areas that are set aside for nature to operate in and of itself is essential. In fact, those of you who have heard of a movement called 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the earth and 30% of the United States by 2030, you should recognize that when that is said, they actually mean 30% of the earth set aside as wildlands, not as actively managed lands. So we recognized that there was this knowledge gap, and so we paired up with a large number of organizations to address that for New England. It took us about 4 years because each of the parcels that is conserved in New England, we had to evaluate to see how they were managed, or whether or not they were managed in accordance with this definition. So as background, let me just talk a little bit about New England history. Now, on Monhegan, there's been a number of studies out in the meadow where people have taken cores down into the depths of the mud to reconstruct climate change and reconstruct the nature of the vegetation over the last 10,000 years. This is a picture of a group of staff, of researchers who work with me in the middle of the Harvard forest doing exactly that kind of work. So we do that kind of work all over New England. And what that has shown is that up until the time of European arrival, there was very little active transformation of the land in New England. The native people who lived here harvested many natural foods from the sea, from the waters, from the land, but they didn't actively transform the landscape. They were not, for example, active agriculturalists. The little bit of horticulture that they practiced was minimal relative to the food base that they harvested from nature. And so their direct impact on the land was very, very slight. And that means that most of New England was operating without direct intervention and direct management. And so this wildlands approach is very much consistent with the way the land has been for a very long period. And just to show one example of this, and you've got many examples of this in the book on Monhegan and at the museum here showing the way the landscape has changed, and of course you have a lot of art. This is from the town of Petersham, Massachusetts. This is looking from a hilltop across the valley at a section of the Harvard forest. And you can see that in the 1800s, that landscape was largely devoid of forest, just small woodlots, but mostly pasture land. And today, exactly the entire area is completely forested. And so we have, across the New England landscape, the same situation you have in Monhegan. You have restricted areas that have continuously been in forest, although they may have been cut for firewood and other things. And then you have big areas that were cleared of forest vegetation and then have come back to forest. And so these two different histories means you have very different types of vegetation in different parts of the island. At the same time, and this is a dynamic that's just much greater than what you've experienced here on Monhegan because you haven't had this wide range of wildlife, but this is from a paper that we wrote on the history of wildlife in Massachusetts. And it looks at the changing dynamic of different species. Some species that were here native to the landscape were extirpated relatively quickly after European arrival, and that would include things like beavers and wolves and eventually cougars. Other species were introduced, and as the forests were cleared, species like bobolink and meadowlark increased because they thrived in this open agricultural landscape. And so the take-home message from all of this is that over the last 400 years, the New England landscape, just like the Monhegan landscape, has been completely dynamic and has not been static and has not supported the same number of species with the same amount of forest or even the same composition of forest over time. So this study that we launched asked, how many wildlands are there? Where are they located? What are their characteristics? And how are they being conserved and protected? And as I say, we covered the entire New England landscape. And so the quick answer is, if you look at New England as a whole, more than 80% of it is covered by forest. 25% of New England is conserved by land conservation groups, state agencies, federal agencies, and towns. And by conserved, we mean they're protected from being developed or transformed into some type of non-natural condition, but they may be very actively managed. But the important point is this study discovered only a little bit more than 3% actually in this condition of wildlands in which nature is allowed to operate unimpeded by human activity. And all of those areas are shown here on this map. And you'll see there are a couple of distinctive characteristics. They tend to be northern, and as you go farther north, they tend to be larger. They tend to be isolated, which means that there are not big areas that are managed in the same way over any extensive part of New England. So they're highly fragmented. And then there's some real peculiarities, like the Appalachian Trail that comes through. Very few people knew before this study, or remembered, that Bent Mackay, who was the architect of the Appalachian Trail, was actually a founding member of the Wilderness Society. And he envisioned the Appalachian Trail to be one continuous wildland that went from northern Maine all the way down to Georgia. As a result, there's a kind of thin, broken ribbon of wildland all along the Appalachian Trail that is currently being worked on to be broadened, strengthened, and enlarged. Okay, so when we looked at wildlands to determine that, yes, here's a piece of conservation land that should belong in this report and be identified this way, we looked at three characteristics, three criteria. First, we established that there needed to be a purposeful intent to protect that land for nature. Second, the management of that land needed to be in parallel with that intent. In other words, there was no active management, but there was a decision by the landowning entity, like the Monhegan Associates, that they would hold the land and hold it for nature and not modify it directly through human activity. And then finally, there needed to be demonstrated permanent protection such that that approach towards management and that status of the land wouldn't change over time. So where are the wildlands? Well, you can actually go on the web and you can just search for wildlands in New England, and you'll come to a web page that has both our report and all the information, but it also has a map that allows you to narrow right into individual parcel levels and see every single wildland and come up with all of the information. There also is a report which is available digitally and in printed versions, which I've left a few copies with Tish and handed out to some of the other board members and members of the Monhegan Associates, that enumerates all the different tracts of land, including the land here on Monhegan. What's fascinating is to look at the variation across the New England states, and in two different ways. One is the amount of land which is conserved this way, and not surprising, being as large as it is, the largest extent is in Maine, and the biggest tracts are in Maine. Acadia National Park is a sizable area, but Baxter State Park is the largest wildland in New England. But what's fascinating is the variation in ownership. So if you look at Maine, for example, you see that this red, this crimson is federal. This is a nonprofit conservation organizations, and this is state ownership. So in Maine, those are pretty well balanced. The largest percentage is in state ownership, but there's a very interesting balance between federal ownership, state ownership, and nonprofit ownership. In Massachusetts, in contrast, 90% of the wildlands are owned by the state. Very few land conservation organizations hold these areas, and there's almost no or very little federal land in the state of Massachusetts. There are small parts of Cape Cod National Seashore that qualify under this, and they represent this. And then, to me, very, very interestingly, New Hampshire, the live free or die state, has almost no state ownership of wildlands. So in other words, all of the state-owned land in New Hampshire is very actively managed for a variety, mostly for timber products. And most of the land that is in this wildlands category is in the White Mountain National Forest, and so it's under federal ownership. So the variation across New England is really, really quite fascinating. This is something I've discussed with a number of people here, and so I want to walk through it very carefully, but we decided that it was important as we looked at these different properties to recognize that they actually were managed and protected in different ways and with different strengths. So we found that although there was a broad tendency, or there was broad uniformity and not actively managing the vegetation at any scale, that in some cases, many organizations do take it upon themselves to manage actively for invasive species or to support rare species, or in some cases even to create overlooks and view sheds and things like that. So there are some very, very strict approaches to management, and I would put Monhegan at kind of the top level of that. And so that would be, let me see if I can point it out without going here. This Harvard Forest Pisgah tract is a very small tract that Harvard University owns in the middle of a state forest in New Hampshire. And we actually allow no direct intervention at all on that property. There are no trails. There's research that's done. People do visit it. We take photographs of it, but we don't allow active soil sampling. We don't allow people to, say, cut trees to determine their age and things like that. So it's a very, very strict policy. On the other hand, there are many properties, many state properties down in here, which are managed with less constraint than that. Then in terms of the permanence of what the wildland status, that is, how strongly is it determined that these areas will never change from this approach towards management? And we basically have a gradient from low to high in terms of the strength of the protection. The highest protection would be if there is legislation or a legal mechanism that keeps that property managed that way in perpetuity. And the lowest level is when that approach towards management is just guaranteed by the current landowners and the management approach that they take as espoused in management guidelines. Now, Monhegan Associates is interesting because it's kind of intermediate between those. There are very strong written statements about the approach to management. There are very explicit policies about it, and the management is very strict in terms of being very minimal. So I would put Monhegan someplace over in here. It's not highly protected in the sense that there's either legislation or legal constraints that would keep the Monhegan Associates from ever doing anything different. But the ethic of the organization, the bylaws, the policies, all the management plans and so on reinforce that approach, which is currently being undertaken. No, you might have gone forward. Anyway, there's Baxter. Thank you. Yeah, there are deed restrictions, there are state statutes, and there are management plans. Okay, Muddy Pond Preserve is actually owned by Northeast Wilderness Trust. The Shelby Perry Works will be here next week. It's 300 acres, so it's owned by a private, non-governmental organization, a conservation organization. It is secured with a conservation easement, which goes with the deed. So no matter who owns that property, it can never be managed in a different way. Here's Monhegan Island. We have that down as 375 acres owned by Monhegan Associates, a non-governmental organization with a strict policy and a strict management plan, but no legal constraints. A state forest up in Vermont, which has a beautiful bog that is protected, that is only protected through administrative designation and a management plan. That means every 10 years when a new management plan is created, there is the potential that they could do something different. So you can see that these areas are all distinctly different, and so there are lots of different flavors of wildlands. Connecticut College is interesting. We don't have the establishment date down here because the earliest one was in the 50s, then in the 70s, and then in the 80s, so it spanned 30 years. But there's 200 acres that are owned by the college. It is only secured by the administration, with one exception. The deed on those lands states that if the college ever decides to do anything different with the land, all of that land needs to be offered to the Nature Conservancy for $1. And so that is a legal constraint. It's not a legislative constraint, but it is something that is going to make the college think twice before they do anything. And then finally, the Nature Conservancy owns an 11,000 acres up in northern New Hampshire. This again has third-party conservation easements. So there are other organizations that are legally obligated to ensure that the Nature Conservancy manages it the way that they do. Okay, at the end of our report, we conclude by setting out some recommendations for future activities. And one of the most important is one which is witnessed here every day, and that is the approach to land conservation and the creation of wildland areas should be done in concert with the community and with a broad understanding and approach to land planning, so that the conserved land is to a certain extent part and parcel of the entire land mass and the entire community's responsibility. And of course, when the first idea came up towards creating the Monhegan Associates, or conserving the land, Ted Edison and other people engaged community members such that there was widespread support for this activity, and the Monhegan Associates has broadly engaged the community ever since that time. And so this is something that is not always done by conservation organizations, and many towns, many states have great divisions between the kind of land planning part of their organization or part of their government and the land conservation part. But they really should be done part and parcel, so that we are conserving our land in appropriate ways so that it supports the community that it surrounds it or is part of it. So that's one of the recommendations. The second recommendation is that every organization or agency that owns its land should look very hard at both its management plan and its long-term approach towards protecting that land to make sure that it will endure over time. And you can do that in a variety of ways. We've encouraged, for example, the state of Massachusetts to actually pass legislation so that all of those state lands, which are now just administratively declared as wildlands, can be permanently protected forever as wildlands. We've encouraged other organizations, and this Northeast Wilderness Trust works with lots of land trusts to put conservation easements on lands that are wildlands. Yes, but you can see that there are federal areas, state areas, and private land trusts that are actively conserving land. And each of these small white lines represents a different sized tract of land. And so this wildland conservation movement, which this island was a part of very early on, is really growing. And so that's actually very gratifying. And then finally, at the end of the paper, we just say, well, what are we going to do? We, that is the authors. And so we've committed to publishing this report, working with organizations to help advance this, working with agencies to help state organizations and agencies increase their amount of land that is conserved and their amount that is in wildlands. We've dedicated part of our budget to maintaining a database on this so that every single wildland that is added in New England is added to our map. And we've actually increased our goal to 20% for New England. And we're trying to integrate wildland conservation with all other types of land planning and conservation. So let me switch gears, having given you our work, and talk a little bit about your work and your care. So, in many ways, having looked at over 145 different areas across New England that we identify as wildlands, I would say that Muskegon stands right at the very top as an exemplar of doing that well, doing it consistently, and doing it in a very rigorous way, which is documented and written down. If you go on the Mohegan Associates webpage and read all of the policies, they are very clear, they are very well thought through, and they are very logical in terms of supporting this wildlands ethic. So, for example, trail creation or trail maintenance. The policy towards that is to do as little as possible to maintain these trails, and that makes terrific sense. Wildlands should be experienced by people, but they don't need to all be boardwalks, and they don't need to be paved trails, and they don't need to be broad. As small as they can be, as minimally maintained as they can be, and this organization does a superb job. And here's just a few of the examples. Even to the point, and this is one of the most difficult point for every organization, is when do you do this, when do you leave it like that? So this is an area that's wet, and the judgment for the policy is that it would actually create more alteration to put a boardwalk, a bridge through, or even stepping stone than people create by going through the areas it is now. But it's really quite extraordinary how well that is thought through. There are policies on signage, and here's two examples. One is the example of the signs that you see when you first enter many of the trails. They're very simple, they're very minimal, they kind of model appropriate behavior, and they describe a few things that are not allowed, including drones. And then there is this very interesting policy to occasionally put out signs about poison ivy. And that's a very interesting one. Many organizations have a sign at the beginning of the trail with a picture of a poison ivy plant, and they intend people to take that image in their head or take a photograph of it and use that for identifying. So that's an interesting policy. But everywhere, the trail signs are minimal, and they're minimal to the point that it's very easy to get lost because you don't necessarily see that little four, that little one, or whatever. And many of the trails are easy to walk right by. There's no real harm in that because then we just wander a little bit farther on other trails before turning back. So I actually love this approach towards trail maintenance and more. There is the very appropriate policy to certainly allow and not attempt to change and alter in any way cultural artifacts that are left in the landscape. And this is actually the same approach that the National Park Service and the Forest Service take in all of their wilderness areas. The old mines, the old shacks, some of the stone walls and rock formations, and certainly the Native American artifacts that are left in the landscape are all allowed to be part of the landscape. They are part of the history of the land. And so leaving those makes great sense. And in Monhegan, you can walk through and see stone walls and old fire rings and other kinds of things. On the other hand, there is a policy called Leave No Trace, which very strongly discourages people from creating new artifacts in the landscape today. So historical artifacts are accepted, new artifacts are managed against. And one of the most contentious of those, I gather, are these little fairy houses. And that's very interesting because the National Park Service has a similar policy against rock cairns and against fairy houses. And if you go to Acadia and you start creating a bunch of fairy houses, the National Park staff will come through and take those down. If you create rock cairns down near the beaches and so on, they will knock those down because those are new human interventions into the land, which from this wildland perspective don't belong. It was, oh my goodness, it was flowering, and so it was actually quite delightful. And because I grew up in New England in a colonial house that was built in an old apple orchard, I love apple trees, and I love the trees here, and I actually really enjoy seeing the trees out there. But they're non-native species that are invasive in your wildlands. And I've never read anyone talking about removing the apples, although maybe they do. But anyway, it's very difficult to find a way to apply those kinds of approaches consistently. And so a kind of hands-off approach makes actually good sense. There's been a lot of discussion about blowdowns and the difficulty of maintaining trails. Any of you in this room who have anything to do with maintaining these trails just need to be congratulated so much because you do a heroic job and you do it really, really well. It's done in a fairly minimal fashion, but it takes a tremendous amount of work. It's really obvious. And unfortunately, there's just going to be more and more of that kind of blowdown over time. Because, and this is true all across New England, our forests are getting older. These Monhegan wildlands are just the trees are going to get bigger, they're going to get taller, they're going to get older, and over time they will fall down and big coastal winds will come along and blow them down. And I think coming to accept natural disturbance as an inherent part of wildlands and completely unexpected events coming to places that you know well is something that we need to get adjusted to. And it's something that needs to be part of a wildland ethic. So maintaining the trails by cutting a few trees or cutting many trees, and then accepting the fact that forests will blow down and be dynamic is something that is part and parcel of being a wildland conservationist. And then finally, one of the really difficult things for all of us living in the here and now to adjust to and to understand is that land conservation and wildland conservation is in perpetuity. It is forever. And so it's not for this generation, it's not even for the next generation or the one following. It is ongoing. And so time is on your side. It is also something that you need to count on. And I illustrate that by, here's a big tree that was along one of the trails that had been cleared. And, that tree's about 75 years old. Well, the red spruce that you have can easily get to be 300 years old. So these forests are still maturing, especially in the areas that used to be fields, but also even in the cathedral woods. And Monhegan is a geological formation. And so you really need to be thinking in terms of geological time as being part of what you are managing with and thinking about. Not just in terms of what's the pressing issue today and what would we like to tweak to make it a little bit better in the next 10 years, because you've got hundreds of years going forward. And so to end, I just wanted to really congratulate everyone who has had anything to do with this land conservation effort here. I show this slide because I think it's very clear that right from the beginning there was an interest in conserving the land for the benefit of the community, to help to maintain a particular type of community. A community that was small, was closely knit, that was tightly tied to the island. And by conserving nature, which so many people enjoyed and so many artists and others have documented, that became a large part of making this island what it is and the whole that it is. And that really is an extraordinary approach and ethic. And let me just end with this reminder that what you are doing is really distinctive. It's not just conserving land from development. It's an approach towards that conservation, which is quite unusual. Thanks very much. So that was long, but what I told Tish was that I hoped to generate some controversy, and then everybody, no matter what their perspective, could attack me rather than argue within the community.
I like the way you called in thunder to make your points.
Good. Got to work with nature.
So speaking of thunder, what are your thoughts about lightning hitting and starting start a fire in the woods?
Yeah. So the percentage of fires that are started by nature in New England is just exceedingly low, exceedingly few. The signage that exists all across the island, and especially right when you enter the island, is right on, which is to remind everybody that fire is a real threat here. And fire is not a real threat all the time. Under particular conditions it is. But fires are ignited by people, and they're ignited by people doing, people behaving in ways that they shouldn't, or people behaving without thinking about it. And so by restricting fires, smoking, reminding people, you've gone a huge way towards dealing with that. It's much more likely that a fire is going to start in the community and spread to the woods than a fire is going to start in the woods and spread to the community. So that is my thought. Now, we do get a lot of lightning, but much of our lightning is associated with good rainstorms.
Yeah.
And so that's very different than out west. And these forests are, they are flammable forests, but there are only limited times when they will burn. So it's not hard to, and of course you've had a history, as does much of New England, of human-set fires spreading across the landscape. I believe that the more you allow your forest to get old, even though that does lead to trees getting blown down, that actually lessens the overall danger. Because these dense areas of young stands, that's what are most flammable and will spread the most rapidly. So I think the approach that is taken is really exceptional, and those people who understand what those little boxes are scattered around, and notice that there's a fire department at both ends of the street and so on, and that even up at the lighthouse there's fire equipment and so on, they will understand what a concern that is. Yeah.
I want to go back to fairy villages.
Okay.
You said something, I didn't get it all. I haven't been out to Cathedral Woods this year. But they're still there, and I know my grandchildren will be very happy to help them along next week. So what is the feeling about having something like that in the middle of the wildland?
So let me answer that from the Monhegan perspective, which is the policy currently is to disassemble those. And so they do get constructed. We were walking out there yesterday and there was a family building 2 or 3 of these. Those get disassembled essentially every day. And the idea is that if they are not there, over time there will be fewer and fewer of them. It is a very challenging topic because, of course, we all want to engage children in nature. And many conservation organizations are trying to find many different devices to do that. There are many places you can go where there are basically stories being told along trails, and you can read those as you go. Or, you know, you've had up here in Maine, and we've had in Massachusetts, and we certainly have had, we go to Denmark every summer, these big trolls that are built so that people will go out in the woods and see. There are a lot of different ways to engage, and some are appropriate in some places and not in others. And so building big trolls out in the wildlands of Monhegan wouldn't be appropriate. Plastering stories along the trails wouldn't be appropriate. And building fairy houses may be something that should be discouraged by removing them on a regular basis.
I just want to chirp in.
Chirp away.
Chirp away. Is that the biggest problem we have with Monhegan Association about fairy houses is when live matter is used, so people take moss, or things are brought in, so shells, glass, seashells. If you can encourage your grandchildren to find a little piece of dead wood and make it no more than an inch high, then they'll
My sons are tyrannical about using only what's on the
yeah. So what you're doing is you're actually training them to take care of the wildlands by being so careful and thoughtful.
Thank you.
So thank you, son. Thank you for having such a nice son.
Yeah, I think that's great because, of course, at the other extreme, you can rip off moss off the ground and mushrooms off of trees. You know, there are places where people go and take a jackknife and cut strips of bark off of birch trees to make roofs for things, and that's actually very damaging to the vegetation. So I'm sure everybody would agree that there are gradations of activities. Yeah.
One suggestion that I heard earlier that I really appreciated was encouraging kids to disassemble their own, build it, have that experience with them, and then let them be the ones to make it. So kind of just
Great idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah. Sure.
So someone who's involved in maintaining trails, there's a couple things. One is the poison ivy and sort of maintaining the accessibility, for instance,
Right.
in the back, versus the keep it wild. If the poison ivy wants to grow there, then have at it. And we've sort of, we spent a lot of time talking about that. Do you have
Yeah.
any?
And I noticed
Thoughts on
it seemed like the loop, let's see, the loop that goes out to Burnt Head and over to Whitehead, that actually gets weed whacked. At least it was, some of it had been weed whacked yesterday when we came out.
I know.
The trails that are, yeah, it was very interesting. I had not seen that previously.
Was it your weed whacker?
No, there was trail maintenance yesterday, and we were chopping.
Yeah, all right, so
Yeah.
It was done by hand.
Yeah,
all right, maybe it was.
Rick Rick-
It was done, there was a lot of it, so that's why I assumed it was by a weed
Yeah, no, that was, they have a lot
It
of,
wasn't a
there was a
week
lot of
whacker, it was-
volunteers.
But it was, and I understood why that was done, I'm not being critical of it,
Yeah.
because that was a place where it would have been very dense, right? And it was constantly brushing against you as you were walking through it. That's the kind of thing that over time you'll have to do less and less of, right? Because as those areas, and those areas will all grow up to big old forests, as they get darker, the poison ivy will not grow. And so you'll have less and less concern about it. I understand why, I mean, my wife got poison ivy very badly just from walking out there 3 days ago. So not on that particular trail, but some other part, and she's pretty careful, or very careful, and she knows how to identify it. So I understand certainly why that's done.
The other part that I worry about is, I mean, especially with COVID, the trails got overloved.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, some of them are pretty beat up.
Uh-huh.
And again, during this, do we sort of let them give the trail a break for 5 or 10 years?
I see. So are you considering doing that?
Probably not,
Uh-huh.
but I would say that would be nice for that section of the wildlands to do that, but we try to keep it accessible, so it's this constant balance between.
Yeah, and I think that these are discussions that never will end, because there are always going to be issues, and there's always going to be levels of intensity of activity. I actually think you do a marvelous job, because the trails are well maintained for people who really want to explore and travel slowly and enjoy the whole trip, and not just beeline it from one place to another. And that's delightful. And there's so many places where you can go where the trails are sizable, and you can ride bikes, and you can do all kinds of things, and 4 or 5 people side by side walking through. That's not Monhegan, and that makes good sense. So, but I think you'll always have debates and discussions about these things. Right?
One thing I've always been curious about is the community is located in one part of the island, and then the rest is wildlands. Yet there's a house at the very northern tip of the island, and I've always wondered about that. I mean, I don't even know if anyone lives there, or how is it accessible, but.
Are you
Yeah,
talking
that's-
about Lobster Cove?
No, I'm talking about the other end, the north. Oh, there's. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course there used to be a house out at Burke, and that property was bought, and the house was disassembled.
Yeah. This is near Green Point.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. That, of course, on a map, or even as you're coming on the island, it really stands out. Yeah.
I appreciate your talking about the basis in a very realistic way. How do we determine what is invasive? Why we like the apple trees but we hate the barberry, and all those kinds of things. 'Cause I don't know. Have you met Fred Fowler?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So he's my brother.
Okay.
We've been here. We've been coming summers for a long time, and I just appreciate the understanding that. We affected this land a long time ago, and in order for it to get back to wild, we got to really let it do its thing. And continuing to try to control it, like you said, might be worse than letting it do its thing.
Yeah, and you're
That's the what I'm taking from it. I'm feeling
Right.
like I'm being more blunt. You are much more diplomatic about it, but I appreciate you sharing that about the invasives.
I don't usually get called that, but thank you. Yeah, and you're extremely fortunate because you don't have that big deer population anymore. Because the landscapes that have that, they're in a lot more trouble, because they're not then getting regeneration of trees, and the landscape is staying that much more open, and the deer tend to exacerbate things like Japanese barberry. So, but I think it is true. We had a student who studied Japanese barberry in central Massachusetts, and there he was able to show that all the populations that were established had actually established early on in the kind of phase that Monhegan has just gone through, or still going through, which is the transition from fields to forests. That many of them got established then from birds scattering the seeds, and that then the forest grew up and they were persistent, but over time they got weaker and weaker and weaker. And some of these studies were done in places where they had controlled for deer, and those were the ones who responded the best. So it also, there's kind of an interesting ethic that people have. People pick particular species that they don't like, and like the apple versus the barberry. Or state agencies, many state agencies have very strict policies about trying to eradicate particular invasive species, and yet they'll introduce pheasant, and they'll introduce non-native trout, and they'll introduce other species for other purposes into the landscape, and that seems completely counterintuitive. If you're going to be strict about plants, why not be strict about but I think you can tolerate. I think recognizing that time is on your side.
But, I don't know, I hope I'm not hogging the floor, but if I can say something
Let's
else.
do one more question.
No,
Okay.
Well, I'm just curious, because it is very encouraging to hear what you're saying about invasives, but I know that I was part of the trail crew a couple times when we were dealing with bittersweet, and that one stresses me out a lot more than barberry. So I don't know if have studies been done with any other species of invasive plant that is concerning from like a tree growth perspective.
So the vines, like bittersweet, over time, they tend to be suppressed by tree growth. Although they do have, in the short term, they have the ability to grow up and completely envelope a tree, and even, pull trees down or cause trees to collapse. And so, when I was an undergraduate, I did a study in a place where that was happening. It was happening with bittersweet. It was also happening with smilax, with catbrier and greenbrier, which were growing all over. And this was a successional area like Monhegan. And the prediction looking at it is this forest is going to be devoured by this growth, and it's not going to let trees. But I've gone back there since, 40 some years later, and now the trees have the upper hand. So again, I think with time we'll be in good shape. And in those situations, a little bit of management goes a long way. You don't have to need to get rid of everything, but if you can just free up a few things, then they'll grow. So there can be gradations. It's like the trails. I think absolutely no management wouldn't work. And the management that's being done is light and expensive. Well, thank you so much.